The Bootstrap Paradox of Historical Influence. Close your eyes and imagine a world where time folds into itself, where ideas travel backward and history is rewritten before it even begins. This is the Bootstrap Paradox of Historical Influence. It begins with a simple question. What if an idea, a document, or a technology could be sent back in time and become the very reason for its own creation? Imagine this. A historian in the year 2080 discovers a brilliant political philosophy written in the 1700s. It reshaped Europe, inspired revolutions, and changed the world. He becomes obsessed with it. He memorizes it, word for word, and travels back in time just to witness the original manuscript being written. But here's the twist. The philosopher who supposedly authored the work died young, never writing anything of the sort. And yet, the historian, panicked, writes down the philosophy from memory and leaves it in the philosopher's study, hoping someone finds it. The world reads it. It spreads. It changes everything. And in 2080, the historian finds it in a book, thinking it originated there. But it didn't. There was no original author. The idea looped into existence with no clear beginning. This is the essence of the bootstrap paradox, named after the expression pulling yourself up by your bootstraps. It's the impossible cycle where something exists simply because it already existed. And when applied to history, it asks, how many of our world-changing ideas were truly original, or were they echoes from the future? Let's drift further. In the archives of World War II, there's a story, possibly myth, possibly more, about a strange radio transmission received by Allied forces. It predicted enemy movements before they happened. Accurate, precise, unbelievable. The strange part, no one ever discovered its source. Some speculate it was a code breaker. Others believe it was never sent from that time. Was it a future warning? A message looped into the past? If true, it saved lives. But who then saved them? History forgets the messenger. The bootstrap paradox isn't just about messages or inventions. It's about influence. Imagine a musician in the 1960s who becomes famous for an entirely new sound. He says he was inspired by a mixtape he found in an old attic. The songs on it are haunting, futuristic, impossible for the time. Years later, a time traveler hears this musician and is blown away. Wanting to preserve the music, he records the songs and loses the tape in an attic. It's the same tape, but who composed the music? Who inspired who? The answer fades like smoke. Think about real history now. What if Einstein's theory of relativity had been whispered to him in a dream, seeded from someone who read it in a future textbook? What if the Great Pyramids were rebuilt again, not by ancient Egyptians, but by future archaeologists who copied what they believed were the originals? When we look back at our ancestors, are we seeing their ideas, or are we staring into a reflection of our own future? There's a strange comfort in this paradox. It removes the burden of originality. It tells us maybe the greatest contributions to history are part of a loop, not stolen, not invented, but recycled across time. Maybe progress doesn't move in a line. Maybe it circles forever. As you drift, Let your mind loosen from the rigidity of time. The bootstrap paradox reminds us that the past and future are not strangers. They are pen pals. They write to each other through art, ideas, inventions, and unexplainable coincidences. That book you love, that quote that changed your life, maybe they were never written in the first place. Maybe they've always just existed, waiting for someone, anyone, to find them, even you. Now sleep. Let time fold. Let your mind echo across the centuries until you forget which moment you're in. The great man paradox. History tells us that some men shape the world, that Napoleon redrew the map of Europe, that Einstein redefined our universe, that Caesar, Churchill, Lincoln, these were giants among men. But what if none of them truly mattered? What if they were simply passengers on a train already set in motion? This is the great man paradox, the belief that history is either driven by exceptional individuals or by unstoppable forces of time, economy, and evolution. And both cannot be true. If Napoleon had died in his youth, would Europe have remained the same? If Einstein had been a clerk forever, would relativity never be known? Or would someone else, another mind, another name, have taken their place? It's easy to glorify the individual. It gives history a face, a name, a story to follow. But history doesn't care about names, only about patterns. The printing press was inevitable. The steam engine, the internet, the bomb. Someone would have discovered them. If not this man, then another. If not now, then soon. The paradox lies here. We build statues of individuals who stood at the crossroads of time and believe they built the road. But what if the road built them? What if Caesar's conquests were less about him and more about a republic rotting from the inside? What if Churchill was just the only man left standing when the storm hit? What if Lincoln wasn't destined to end slavery, but simply happened to be in the chair when the world decided it had had enough? It's a strange thought that heroes are made by history, not the other way around, and that the person you admire most might have been interchangeable. But the paradox goes deeper. Sometimes, one decision by one man changes everything. The assassination of Archduke Ferdinand by a single teenager sparked a world war. A simple no, spoken by Rosa Parks, reshaped civil rights. So which is it? Do individuals matter? Or are they illusions of control? Perhaps they're both. Perhaps history is a storm, and sometimes, rarely, one person steps into the eye of it and holds their ground. But the storm still moves, the wind still blows, and eventually, the ground beneath them shifts. The great man paradox humbles us. It tells us that while people matter, they are often swept up in tides they cannot see. And yet, it also offers hope, because if great moments are built on context, then perhaps anyone, at any time, could rise, not because they were destined, but because history happened to need them. So when you hear that someone changed the world, ask yourself, did they really? Or did the world change them? Let that question settle in your chest. Let it soften your thoughts, and let it remind you that no one walks alone in history. We are all part of something vast. something moving, something paradoxical. Sleep with that truth and know that the next great moment might not need a great man, just someone in the right place at the right time. The repeating fallacy. We are told that history repeats itself, that wars come in cycles, that empires rise and fall and rise again, that every golden age ends in excess and every collapse ends in rebirth. And yet, for something we supposedly know so well, we never seem to learn from it. This is the repeating fallacy, the paradox of remembering history while endlessly repeating its mistakes. Why do we study the past so obsessively only to ignore its warnings? Why do we teach our children about the horrors of war and then send them to fight new ones? Why do we document economic crashes, genocides, failed ideologies, and then stumble into them again with different flags, new slogans, shinier uniforms? The answer is uncomfortable. It may be that knowing history changes nothing, that the knowledge itself is powerless against the tide of human nature, that the same fears, hungers, and ambitions are reborn with every generation, dressed in different clothes, singing the same song. In ancient Rome, senators warned of moral decay, public apathy, and a widening gap between rich and poor. They called it the decline of virtue. We call it the news. In 1789, the French overthrew a corrupt monarchy, dreaming of liberty and equality. A decade later, a military dictator ruled them with an iron fist. In 1917, Russians toppled a czar in the name of freedom, only to replace him with gulags and fear. And today, we warn about authoritarianism, inequality, division, as if these are new. They're not. They're echoes. We don't repeat history because we forget it. We repeat it because we are it. Each age believes it is smarter, more evolved, more prepared than the last. Each generation thinks, we've learned. We won't make those mistakes again. And yet, we do, over and over. That's the paradox. The repetition isn't in history, it's in us. We are the loop. We are the echo chamber. We read about ancient mistakes as if they were distant tragedies, when in truth, they are practice runs for our own disasters. So, what's the point of remembering? Why teach the past if the present always ignores it? Because sometimes, just sometimes, a spark of awareness changes the course. A protest prevents a war. A book shifts a mind. A lesson sinks in. Not always, not often, but enough. The fallacy is not in history repeating. The fallacy is in thinking we're immune to it. History isn't a list of events, it's a mirror. And most of the time, we refuse to look into it. We look at the fall of the Roman Empire and forget the fragile systems we ourselves rely on. We look at the Holocaust and tell ourselves, that could never happen here. We study the Black Death and then laugh at pandemic warnings. We praise the Renaissance and ignore the dark centuries that followed. We admire the rise of democracy and forget how quickly it crumbles when people trade freedom for comfort. So maybe history doesn't repeat itself perfectly. Maybe it rhymes. And the verse we're living now sounds a lot like the ones before it, not because we've forgotten, but because remembering isn't always enough. We remember the fire, but still play with the match. We remember the flood, but still build on sand. We remember the fall, but still climb the same cliff. And even when we know the story, we want to live it anyway, because somewhere in us, we believe we'll get it right this time. We won't, but we try. And in that trying, there is beauty. In that pattern, there is pain. And in that paradox, there is history. So, rest now. Let the weight of centuries lift from your shoulders. Let the loops play out without you for just a while. And know this, even if we fail to learn from the past, we are part of it. And that too is a kind of immortality, the paradox of forgotten revolutions. Every revolution begins with fire, with voices in the street, with banners held high, fists raised, and promises of a new world. A moment when everything seems possible, a time when history pivots. And yet, most revolutions are forgotten, not in name, but in meaning. We remember that they happened, but not why, not what they felt like, inside the bones of the people who risked everything, not what was truly lost or gained. This is the paradox of forgotten revolutions. We celebrate the outcome while erasing the process. We quote dates and names while forgetting fear and hunger, compromise and betrayal. The French Revolution was meant to bring liberty, equality, fraternity. It brought guillotines and then an emperor. The Russian Revolution promised a classless paradise. It delivered purges and silence. Even the American Revolution, born in cries of freedom, left entire populations, women, slaves, indigenous peoples, outside its definition of liberty. So what, then, is a revolution? Is it the moment when power changes hands? Or the long years that follow, when ideals are tested and often abandoned? Revolutions promise change, but what they rarely promise is peace. Because to build a new world, the old one must burn. And when the fire fades, someone must clean the ashes. And often, those people, those quiet workers of the new age, are never remembered. Names carved into marble are not the ones who fed the starving, who reprinted the books, who stitched together the fabric of daily life from the shredded cloth of what came before. Instead, we remember the slogans, the myths, the heroic version with the sharp edges sanded down. We forget the betrayals, the uncertainty, the confusion. The paradox is this: a revolution lives in memory as a straight line, but in reality, it is a storm, unpredictable, chaotic, human, and yet we crave it. Over and over again, we rebel, we resist, we overturn, and just as quickly, we forget. Perhaps it is because revolution is intoxicating, not just in the streets, but in the mind. It gives people something to believe in until that belief becomes inconvenient. And then we move on. We tell the next generation only the parts that make us look noble. We edit the pain. We clean the narrative. We turn revolution into tradition. And in doing so, we bury the very spirit that once set it ablaze. So what happens when revolution becomes ritual? When rebellion becomes heritage? It loses its teeth. It becomes a holiday. And the people who once bled for it become statues, unable to speak, unable to warn. The danger isn't in forgetting the revolution. It's in remembering the wrong parts, in teaching the climax, but not the cost, in glorifying the victory, but not the vacuum that follows, in believing that just because the palace was stormed, justice arrived. But justice takes longer. It does not come with a mob. It comes with patience and failure and questions. And most of all, memory, true memory, not the sanitized kind, not the classroom summary, but the messy, tangled truth of what it means to try and start over. So when the next revolution comes, and it always does, ask yourself, will we remember it? Will we truly learn from it? Or will it too become another clean story told in a dirty world? Another paradox wrapped in flags and forgetting. Let that thought drift through you, not to disturb your peace, but to give you permission to see history not as a straight line, but as a spiral, a revolution of revolutions, the paradox of historical greatness. Some names echo through the corridors of time: Alexander, Caesar, Genghis, Napoleon, Lincoln, Churchill. We call them great. We carve their faces in stone, name streets after them, teach children to admire them. But here lies the paradox. Greatness in history often walks hand in hand with destruction. The more impact a person had, the more lives were shattered in their wake. What makes someone great in the eyes of history is rarely their compassion. It is their ability to reshape the world, and reshaping is never gentle. Alexander spread Greek culture from Macedonia to India, but also burned cities, enslaved thousands, and died young, leaving chaos behind. Genghis Khan united the Mongols and connected the East and West through trade, but did so by wiping out entire civilizations. Napoleon brought law and reform to parts of Europe, but crowned himself emperor and drowned nations in war. So, we must ask, is greatness moral, or is it just memorable? History remembers those who leave scars, not necessarily because they were good, but because they were effective. And this is the paradox. The more influence someone has, the harder it becomes to judge them by ordinary standards. We forgive tyrants because they built nations. We excuse violence because it brought stability. We admire boldness even when it came with blood. It's as if history doesn't care about ethics, only outcomes, only legacies, only footprints large enough to survive the erosion of time. But what about those who healed instead of conquered, who saved lives instead of taking them? What about the quiet revolutionaries, the thinkers, the teachers, the peacemakers? They are remembered too, but rarely with the same reverence, because their impact is harder to measure. A war changes borders overnight. An idea takes centuries to bloom. And so, the paradox deepens. We call someone great for conquering half the world, but rarely for feeding it. We build monuments to kings who broke nations, but not to farmers who kept them alive. We immortalize those who brought order through force and forget those who brought change through kindness. Perhaps this is not history's flaw, but ours. We are drawn to drama, to crisis, to power. We find poetry in the rise and fall of empires, in the clash of swords, in the defiance of death. But often, the real greatness lies elsewhere, in the unnoticed gesture, in the unrecorded moment of mercy, in the choices made when no one was watching. And those are the hardest to preserve, because history is written by survivors, not saints, by scribes, not sages, by those with ink, power, and time. And yet, we still try to define greatness, to make sense of who mattered, to separate fame from significance, noise from truth. So, perhaps the final paradox is this: the truly great figures in history are the ones we barely notice because they didn't conquer, they connected, they didn't dominate, they endured, they didn't command armies, they moved hearts. Their names may not echo loudly in textbooks, but their actions ripple quietly through time, changing everything without needing to be remembered. And maybe that is the greatest form of greatness, one that asks for nothing in return, one that leaves no monument behind, only a better world. The paradox of peace through war. War is destruction, explosions, blood, smoke, silence that follows only after cities are gone. And yet, we've called war the path to peace, a necessary evil, a noble sacrifice, a cleansing fire. Throughout history, the paradox repeats. We fight wars to end wars. We kill to preserve life. We destroy to protect what we love. But how can violence be the guardian of peace? This question echoes from every battlefield. The Roman Empire called its brutal expansion Pax Romana, Roman peace. Peace, they said, came after conquest, after submission, after resistance was crushed and voices were silenced. It was peace built on fear, not harmony. Centuries later, the same logic was used by empires across the world, from Napoleon to the British Crown to modern superpowers. Bring order, enforce stability, call it peace. But what kind of peace begins with firebombs? What kind of safety comes from trenches and graves? World War I was called the war to end all wars. It led to World War II, and World War II, the deadliest conflict in human history, gave birth to the atomic bomb, the very invention meant to prevent future wars, created the power to end all life, mutually assured destruction. That's what kept the Cold War from becoming hot. We didn't stop fighting because we found peace. We stopped because the price of violence became too high. This is the paradox. The more powerful our weapons become, the more fragile peace feels. Because peace, under threat, is not true peace. It's a pause, a waiting room, a negotiation with silence. And even when war seems just, when one side is clearly oppressive, cruel, monstrous, victory rarely brings peace in the way we imagine. The aftermath is filled with ghosts, trauma passed down, borders redrawn, but never truly settled, new resentments born from old victories. Each time humanity says, this time it will be different. We must fight now so our children won't have to. And yet, the children grow up and fight again. Different flags, same logic. Sometimes the war is internal, a civil war, a revolution, a purge. Sometimes the war is for liberation, but even then, the paradox holds. The moment of freedom is bought with pain, and in the rubble, peace is not guaranteed. Power vacuums form, old enemies return in new uniforms. Utopias promised turn into new regimes, and the cycle begins again. Why does history cling to this contradiction? Perhaps because peace is not exciting. It doesn't write songs or paint glory. It's quiet, ordinary, hard to notice. But war is loud. War shapes borders. War makes legends. And so we retell its stories more often. We memorialize it. We wrap it in honor. We make it heroic, even when it wasn't. And in doing so, we convince ourselves it was necessary, that it had meaning, that it brought us closer to peace. But what if the path to peace was never through war? What if that's a myth we tell ourselves because we haven't found another way? What if the real warriors are not those who fight, but those who prevent fighting before it begins? The diplomats, the poets, the parents, the ones who build bridges instead of battlements. They don't get parades. Their names are rarely carved into marble. But maybe they should be, because peace through war is peace built on ruins, and ruins whisper of what could have been. So the next time we look back at a war and say, at least it brought peace, perhaps we should ask, peace for whom? Peace for how long? And was there another road we refuse to see? Because true peace is not the absence of war, it is the presence of understanding, and understanding is far harder to win. The paradox of the invisible majority. Open any history book, and you'll find the names of kings, generals, philosophers, inventors, voices that shook the world, or so we're told. But what about the others? The millions who lived, worked, and died anonymously, the mothers who raised generations, the farmers who fed empires, the builders who never signed their creations, the children who never had time to grow old. History is shaped by the many, yet told by the few. That is the paradox. For every crowned ruler, there were thousands who lifted the throne. For every general who marched, there were thousands who followed and fell. Yet only the leader is remembered. The rest dissolve into the fog of time. We call this progress. But progress was paved by backs that bent and hands that bled. And still, their names are missing. We remember the man who built the machine, but not the girl who greased the gears. We celebrate the speech that ended a war, but not the nurse who held the dying in silence. History often feels like a spotlight, bright, focused, narrow, and behind the light, a vast shadow of the forgotten. The paradox deepens because these forgotten ones were the majority. They were the heartbeat. They baked the bread, harvested the fields, fought in the lines, wrote the letters, and kept the fire alive in cold winters. They were never in power, but they powered everything. Still, history treats them like scenery. They are the background of the great drama, not the players. But who decides who the players are? Powerful men wrote the chronicles. They told us who mattered. They made their enemies into villains and themselves into heroes, and everyone else into silence. But silence isn't absence, it's just unrecorded life. And sometimes that life speaks louder than the loudest battle. Imagine a world without the invisible ones. No markets, no homes, no songs passed from mouth to mouth. History would collapse. So why don't we remember them? Maybe because remembering is hard. It takes effort to listen to voices never written down. It takes humility to say, I don't know their names, but I owe them everything. In recent years, we've started to dig deeper, to find fragments of the forgotten, a thread of fabric, a diary buried in dust, bones in a shared grave, a name scratched onto a wall, and in those fragments, a story unfolds, not of conquest, but of survival, of people who endured even when no one was watching. That, too, is greatness, quiet greatness, measured not in crowns or empires, but in the steady rhythm of a life lived for others. The paradox is this: the majority shaped the world, yet were denied a place in the memory of it. And still, they came, they built, they loved, they gave more than they took. Their reward was not glory, but continuity. Without them, there is no past, and there is no future. So, maybe we should stop asking who made history and start asking who kept it from falling apart. Because the invisible ones never needed statues, they needed each other. And somehow, that was always enough. The paradox of the lost golden ages. We long for golden ages, times when life was better, simpler, pure. Every generation looks back and wonders, where did we go wrong? As if the past was a garden we somehow wandered out of. But history plays a strange game with memory. It polishes the old, softens the rough edges, turns hardship into honor and pain into poetry. This is the paradox of the Golden Age. The further it drifts into the past, the brighter it seems, and the more we chase it, the more it disappears. Ask an elder when the world made sense. They'll name a time from their youth. Ask their parents. They'll point even further back, a chain of nostalgia stretching into centuries of imagined perfection. But dig beneath the glow, and you'll find a different picture. The so-called golden ages were filled with inequality, disease, oppression, wars just outside the frame. Ancient Athens, often hailed as the cradle of democracy, excluded women, slaves, and foreigners from citizenship. Its golden light came from the labor of the invisible. The Renaissance flourished under patronage, but also under plague and burning heretics. The 1950s, seen as a golden age by some, held beneath its polished surface the rigid walls of segregation, conformity, and fear. Golden ages are not lies. They are selective truths, moments when art, science, or stability surged forward, but always, for some, never for all. We remember the cathedrals, but not the hunger. We quote the poets, but not the prisoners. We celebrate the invention, but forget the exploitation that made it possible. And still, we crave the idea, because golden ages give us comfort. They suggest there was a time when things were right, and if it happened once, maybe it can happen again. But what if this craving holds us back? What if the obsession with a perfect past blinds us to the complexity of the present? Progress is not a line, it's a spiral, sometimes upward, sometimes in circles, sometimes falling before it rises again. And while we look backward, longing for golden light, we miss the quiet beauty unfolding now. A child learning to read, a community rebuilding after loss, a moment of peace between strangers, small lights, often unnoticed, but real. Maybe the idea of a golden age isn't about time. Maybe it's about feeling safe, seen, connected, and that feeling can be found, not just remembered. The past can guide us, it can inspire us, but it can also trap us in illusions. We must ask, was the golden age real, or was it simply golden for a few, while others remained in shadow? Because a true golden age wouldn't need to be remembered as myth. It would be felt by all equally. And maybe, just maybe, the brightest ages are not behind us, but ahead, waiting not to be rediscovered, but to be created together. The paradox of civilization and collapse. Civilization is built slowly, stone by stone, law by law, dream by dream. It takes centuries to rise, but sometimes only days to fall. This is the paradox of civilization and collapse. What takes lifetimes to build can vanish in an instant, and what vanishes often leaves behind more questions than answers. The Mayans built vast cities deep in the jungle. Their calendars marked the heavens. Their temples still rise like frozen thoughts in stone. But one day, their cities were abandoned. No war, no fire, just silence. Why? We're still not sure. The Roman Empire once stretched across continents. It had roads, aqueducts, courts of law, and systems we still mimic today. But it collapsed, slowly, then suddenly. Barbarians, plague, corruption, overreach, or perhaps all of it at once. And yet, to those living through it, collapse wasn't dramatic. It was quiet. Food cost more. Streets became unsafe. Familiar rules no longer worked. The world shifted slowly until it didn't. Civilizations collapse not just when walls fall, but when people stop believing in them. That's the paradox. Stability feels permanent until it isn't. Institutions seem eternal until they crack. Ideas seem unshakable until they're replaced. But there's another side to this story, because out of collapse comes renewal. After the fall of Rome, Europe fractured. But out of that darkness came cathedrals, universities, new languages, and revolutions of thought. After the Maya vanished, their descendants lived on in stories, in rituals, in ways of seeing the world that modern eyes are still trying to understand. Collapse is not the end, it's a turning. a transformation? What if the fall of a civilization isn't failure, but a sign that something else is needed? Maybe what collapses is the shell, and what survives is the seed. We fear collapse because it feels like death, but in nature, death feeds new life. A forest fire clears space for new trees. An old structure crumbles so that something lighter, more adaptable, can rise. Perhaps civilization is not a single line, but a cycle: rise, flourish, strain, fall, renewal. And in that cycle, there's a strange kind of peace, because nothing is permanent, but nothing is ever truly lost. The stones of fallen empires are reused, their words are translated, their dreams sometimes still live in our architecture, our laws, our fears, and our hopes. So when we ask, why did they collapse? We might also ask, what are we building now that might outlast us? Civilizations fall, but the human story doesn't end. It shifts, adapts, begins again. And maybe the greatest paradox of all is that collapse, terrifying as it may seem, is often the doorway to something we couldn't yet imagine. The paradox of the silent conquerors. History remembers the loud ones, the generals, the emperors, the warriors with bloodied swords and cities aflame behind them. We name centuries after conquests. We mark maps with the boundaries they drew in fire. We write poems and textbooks about the noise they made. But what about the quiet ones? The ones who conquered not with war, but with words, not with fire, but with ideas, not by taking life, but by changing minds. This is the paradox of the silent conquerors. They won without battle, and yet their victories endure longer than any empire. No marching armies, no burning cities, just thought carried from person to person, like a whisper that outlasts a scream. When the great kingdoms of Mesopotamia fell, their gods vanished with them, but their inventions, writing, numbers, laws, survived, not by force, but by usefulness. When the Buddha left his palace and sat beneath a tree, he didn't raise an army, he raised a question, and that question spread across continents, carried not by horses, but by those who had nothing but robes and silence. When Confucius spoke of harmony, ritual, and respect, he was dismissed in his time, ignored by kings. He died, believing he had failed. But centuries later, his words would shape dynasties. He never led a single soldier, but he helped govern billions across millennia. And then there's Jesus, a man born in poverty, executed by a state that considered him irrelevant. He wrote no books, led no revolt, and yet his story redefined calendars, not by force, but by faith. Silent conquerors don't take land, they take root. Their victories are invisible at first. One mind changed, then another, and another. They leave no statues behind, just seeds. And those seeds grow quietly in the cracks of crumbling empires. Consider how the printing press spread ideas faster than any army, how the compass reshaped trade more than any fleet, how antibiotics saved more lives than any war ever protected. Power doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers. And what about the conquerors who didn't even know they were conquering? Grains like wheat and rice traveled further than any pharaoh or king. They changed diets, cultures, economies without a word. They bent entire civilizations around their needs. Is a conqueror still a conqueror if they never intended to rule? Even diseases, like smallpox, reshaped the world in silence. They didn't declare war, but they ended entire nations. And yet, not all silent forces destroy. Some liberate. Think of music, of mathematics, of philosophies written in solitude that now echo in every classroom. They move without borders. They're taught, not enforced. They spread because people choose them, because they resonate. And that's the paradox. True power doesn't always look like power. Sometimes the most transformative forces in history don't raise armies, they raise consciousness. So we must ask, what ideas are we allowing to conquer us now? What beliefs are reshaping us? Not through violence, but through repetition. Every scroll through a screen, every shared story, every word passed from teacher to student is a tiny conquest, not of land, but of the mind. And while kings rise and fall, while flags are replaced, these silent conquests endure. They linger, shape us, and often we don't even notice we've been changed. So when you think of history, don't just listen to the noise. Listen to the silence between, because sometimes it's not the generals who win the longest war, it's the ideas they never saw coming.